Hello, everybody. Welcome to Families and Trauma. I am very excited that you're here. I'm very excited about this course, and I hope that you get a lot out of it. We're going to do several things over the next several weeks. We're going to uh, be looking at trauma from a few different lenses. We're going to just kind of introduce trauma in this first unit, talk about the history of trauma study, and then we will begin to look at some of the specific types of trauma. In the second unit, we'll look at theory and effects of trauma, and in the third unit, we'll continued looking at effects of trauma and then move into treatment and how might we begin to treat trauma in the families that we work with. So lots of information going to be packed into a few small weeks. You should have received the syllabus already. It's also on Blackboard. You can look at that syllabus. Always go back to that. That will be good for you as a reference for what's coming up, what we're going to be doing, and what's expected of you. Two big things that you need to know. For just about every mod in each unit, there will be some kind of journal writing entry for you to complete. Those entries need to take in everything was discussed in that mod, and before that mod, everything that you have read. I want to see that you are comprehending and able to apply and the things that we are talking about in those. So there will be 10 of those worth 250 points. So more than half of your grade in this class will be those journals. And then towards the end of the third unit, we'll talk about the major paper that is written for this class, which will be a little different than most papers that you've written, especially for me. And we'll explain more about that later on, but you can definitely consult your syllabus for quick notes on that if you'd like to look at that right now. Okay, so today what we're going to do is just jump into an introduction to trauma. Hopefully by now everyone has a copy of this book, Trauma and Recovery, by Dr. Judith Herman. This is a classic text in trauma literature. It's something that every student who is studying trauma should have access to and read at least once in your career. I've read mine a few times now. It has not only helped me as a professional, especially dealing with teenagers and early adult students, it has helped me in my personal life as well, just to kind of understand how I respond to and deal with trauma as an individual and how my family has responded to and dealt with trauma as a system. So definitely want you in that book. You're going to be reading through that book rather quickly. But for today, let's just go ahead and jump into an introduction of trauma. Now we will start here just with this broad term of families and trauma. And I want you to know that while we are calling this class Families and Trauma, we're not just going to focus on families. We also will be focusing on individual responses to trauma as well, because I think family responses are often guided and impacted by the individual family members' responses to trauma. So we're going to be looking at trauma from a couple of different lenses. So let's start with some basic review. What we know about stress or risk is that it is good. Some stress, some risk is good. It keeps the family moving, it keeps the system engaged, it helps it to continually adjust and adapt and find balance or homeostasis, if we want to use a big scientific word for that. Some risk, some stress is good for us as individuals or families. But when stress or risk is sudden, when it's unexpected, when it is severe or prolonged, or when it becomes repetitive, then it becomes a problem. And we might call that trauma. Or when stress causes physical injury or threat to life, or some kind of humiliation, or destruction of community, or social support systems, then it becomes a problem. And we might call that trauma. So what do we need to know about traumatized families? Well, there's a few things. First, we can assume that there will be denial at some level, that this has happened, that it could happen again, that we are traumatized. Everything's going to be okay. We can expect or assume fragility. These families are going to be fragile. They're going to be in the midst of pain and hurt and grief. They're fragile. And we can assume that by and large, in the middle of trauma, most of us have no idea how to cope with that. Coping comes with time, and hopefully we will adopt good coping skills. But in the middle of trauma, it's a pretty safe assumption to say that most of us, as individuals or as family systems, we just don't know what to do. We have no idea how to cope, what comes next, where to turn, and those types of things. And it is really important for us to note that how we deal with trauma, how we understand and behave and react to traumatic events in our lives is going to be absolutely dependent upon how we define trauma. How do we define trauma? I've shared this with you in other classes, and I think this maybe highlights this the best in my mind. Having a child with a disability unexpectedly is very much a traumatizing event for a family. We would definitely consider that a traumatic event. However, our response in my own family to that trauma looked fundamentally different than in other families who also have a child with disability, based on how we defined trauma. Was trauma something that is overbearing or something to be overcome? Is trauma something to be viewed as holding us down or something to persevere through? Is this particular event considered trauma? Or is it considered a stress that we can get through? So how we deal with trauma is going to depend on how we define trauma, and we're not all going to define it the same way. We're not all going to deal with it the same way. And so we have to be aware of that, cognizant of that when we are working with families. For purposes of this class, how are we going to define trauma? Well, we're going to define it like this. It is stress that is overwhelming, involves threat, involves vulnerability, and involves a loss of control. And we will define the experience of trauma as a common event. It is my belief that most, if not all of us in this course right now, have experienced trauma either firsthand, we have been traumatized, or as secondary victims, we have seen someone we love be traumatized, and we have dealt with and responded to trauma in that way. We're going to talk about both of those over the course of the next few weeks. I also want us to understand the typologies of trauma. Two major types, interpersonal and non-interpersonal. Interpersonal types of trauma are going to be types of trauma where there is relational types of events occurring. So being robbed by someone, being physically or sexually assaulted, by someone. Abuse, interpersonal violence, domestic violence, child abuse, those types of things are interpersonal traumas. And also witnessing someone else being seriously injured, witnessing someone else being abused, witnessing someone else being assaulted, those things, that is an interpersonal trauma itself. Non-interpersonal trauma are going to be things like natural disasters, accidents, those type of things that we don't see coming, terrorism, maybe big types of things can be non-interpersonal. So want us to know those typologies as well. All right, well, that's a basic introduction to trauma and where we're going to go. Here's what you need to complete for this module, Unit 1, Mod 1. Obviously, download the PowerPoint and watch this lecture, which hopefully you have done. Then I want you to begin reading in the Herman text, Trauma and Recovery. I want you to make sure that you have read the introduction and the first 6 chapters, which I believe is section 1 of this book. So make sure you read the introduction, the first 6 chapters. You'll need to read that for this unit. So spend some time over the next couple of days reading through those first 6 chapters. I really think that you will enjoy this book. And then for the final thing to do in this mod, I'm going to want you to open and complete the journal entry number 1, which you can find right there in Blackboard along with the other files, the PowerPoint and the lecture. You can find this there as well. Open that journal entry, listen and read what needs to be done, and then complete that. And I will see you back here for Unit 1, Mod 2. Have a great day.